Hi, how are you? I'm Will Valley. I'm a comic book artist, an animator. I've made indie flicks. I'm also an internet asshole. Tonight, I want to talk about Ghostbusters 3 or Ghostbusters Afterlife. I think it might be the worst sequel ever made in the history of film.
The integrity and quality of the Ford name.
Maintenance procedures, safety features.
Flexibility.
The built-in release makes it simple to use.
You'll want to review these from time to time.
After the hood is popped,
If you need to change a tire,
a word of caution.
this rear crosspiece can be adjusted to accommodate different load sizes.
It's messy situations.
See how simple it is?
While we're here,
You'll find in your glove compartments
oil filler tube, things like that.
So the premise of Ghostbusters Afterlife is essentially that this is a sort of passing of the torch to a younger generation. But unfortunately, for the majority of the movie, I would say the entirety of the movie, you have one nonsensical scene that takes place after another. I'm going to go full spoilers into this, so I feel like if you haven't seen the movie by now, you can go watch it. It's probably on Netflix. However, I won't be pulling any punches, so I don't want people to be upset if I reveal something that turns out to be a major plot point. One of the biggest issues with this movie, and this seems to be predominant in, I would say, the majority of sequel films, reboots, etc., in the past, I would say 10, possibly 15 years. And this is what the internet refers to as member berries, the idea that, hey, remember this thing that you saw earlier? Well, we're going to inject it into this property so that you have the same reaction you did, hopefully, to the time you saw it previously. And this is the laziest form of filmmaking that you will ever see.
Are you a god?
Ray?
Oh, come on, Ray. Yes.
Yeah, we're all gods.
Song.
Whenever you go self-referential, you're essentially suggesting to the audience that you are completely out of ideas. So I think it would be important to explain the difference between an homage and fan service, because the majority of this movie is fan service. I think it tries to pretend that it's homage. The thing about fan service is it requires you to know the reference before you see the new imagery to understand the imagery and have an appreciation of it. And usually if you don't understand it, it either falls flat or it wastes your time. And unfortunately, a lot of times in these newer sequels, the fan service is actually in direct relation to the story. And you are required to understand the references. Otherwise, the story doesn't make any sense. An homage is different because it doesn't necessarily require you to have any prior knowledge of whatever the shot, the reference, the dialogue is before you go in. Usually, it's just something that the director does because he wants to honor the previous filmmakers that inspired him to make the current movie.
I'm one of those guys that loves movies. I love Howard Hawks. I love Jean-Pierre Melville. The Thing was probably the one movie of all the like individual films that I've seen that like probably influenced dogs the most, because it's in some ways it's very like it's the same idea where you have a bunch of guys trapped in a situation that they can't get out of, in a very claustrophobic situation where nobody can trust anybody else.
And now I think that there are people who would say that Jason Reitman was trying to honor and reference his father, with homage in this movie. But I think there's a huge difference between referencing a great piece of 80s, action, science fiction, what have you, and Daddy, Please Notice Me.
My dad says you guys are full of crap.
Jason?
Well, some people have trouble believing in the paranormal.
No, he just says you guys are full of crap, and that's why you went out of business.
So the movie starts out with Egon Spengler. Egon Spengler, one of the original Ghostbusters, has now moved to this dirt town in Oklahoma. There he's conducting experiments because he thinks that Gozer is returning. And for whatever reason, he wasn't able to convince any of the other Ghostbusters that this was a threat worth looking into, which is antithetical to the point of the character, because the character is supposed to be one of the smartest, most brilliant scientists in the world.
Well, let's say this Twinkie represents the normal amount of psychokinetic energy in the New York area. According to this morning's sample, it would be a Twinkie 35 feet long, weighing approximately 600 pounds.
That's a big Twinkie.
Very early in the movie, you start to see that this is only going to be a film about people trying to remember other better movies. And that is the most egregious thing that come out of this movie. Not 5 minutes in are we hit with a reference where the arms come out of the sofa chair to try to grab Egon. Again, this is only worth noting if you've seen the previous movies. And you can tell very early that this movie is completely bereft of any creativity. And so essentially this scene lines up the entirety of the movie, because every scene after that is going to have some type of reference where you feel like, yeah, I understand it's a Ghostbusters movie, but there's nothing about this that is uniquely interesting, different, or creative in any way.
Are you troubled by strange noises in the middle of the night?
You experience feelings of dread in your basement or attic?
You or any of your family ever seen a spook, specter, or ghost? If the answer is yes, then don't wait another minute. Pick up your phone and call the professionals. Ghostbusters.
We then cut to a scene where we cut to Egon's family. This is his daughter, this is his grandkids. Unfortunately, the timeline doesn't even really make any sense, because his daughter would have to be at least 40 years old, which would make her 10 in the events of Ghostbusters 2, and make her probably about 4 or 5 in Ghostbusters 1. Well, we've never heard about his family before. And I mean, I know in real life, I believe Harold Ramis had a daughter who was about the same age, but within the context of the previous films, him having any type of family is never brought up. Now, this is kind of important, because if you're going to have a storyline that is based off of the fact that he had a family, we really should have heard at some point earlier in the 4 hours of previous content that he had a family. So this is what they call a retcon. This is one of those things where they try to say, well, it was always like this.
You ever done this before? On a chimp.
But the idea of it contradicts the character from the previous movies.
What are we doing?
Well, now the daughter has kids, and these kids are in this town and they don't know what to do. Essentially, they have to move out to this place because they have no money, and they're looking to sell this old estate. You would think that you're setting up some type of haunted house movie, but that has nothing to do with anything. They move out to this property and nothing ever comes up. For whatever reason, Janine Melnitz shows up and she says, oh yeah, this isn't worth anything. We don't understand why the family doesn't have any money to begin with. We don't understand why Janine thought it was worth it to fly from New York to Oklahoma just to tell them this. The mother, played by Carrie Coon, then goes on to do nothing. She never gets a job. We don't know what she's doing in the town. She doesn't come up with a plan to try to either rescue the farm or sell the farm. We just know that they're living there. Now, you could even make an argument like, well, this is the last resort that she has to try to take care of her family. Unfortunately, we are never told why, even to begin with, they had to move. We know that they're going to get evicted, but I mean, is she just a terrible mother? Can she not hold a job? Does she have priors? None of these questions are ever asked, and none of them are definitely ever answered. We then cut to the granddaughter, Phoebe, played by McKenna Grace. McKenna Grace has decided that she wants to go to summer school, if only just to keep her mind and nose in books.
I love learning. This is a state-sponsored work camp for delinquents.
Take my chances with public education.
She goes there, and Paul Rudd is the teacher for the summer school, and they hit it off right away. They are probably the only two good actors in the entire movie, but Paul Rudd plays Paul Rudd, and Paul Rudd is acting in a completely different movie.
My hands hurt from galloping.
He's under the impression that this is, as it should be, a sort of horror comedy. Nobody else in this movie knows what movie they're in. One of the major issues is that Jason Reitman does not make large action comedies. He never has. And so this movie sort of finds itself folding in on becoming this sort of sad indie drama, which is completely the opposite of what a Ghostbusters movie is.
When I started directing movies, I came out of Sundance and the Toronto Film Festival. I made movies like Thank You for Smoking and Juno and Up in the Air. I was always more of an independent filmmaker.
Ghostbuster movies, these were, especially at the time, the equivalent of superhero films. It was about this collection of guys who, through ingenuity, were able to take on massive, powerful forces, and they were, essentially schlubby exterminators, and they were everyday guys. And that's why so many people liked them, and that's why so many people resonated with them over the last 35, 40 years. We're also introduced to Finn Wolfhard, who plays Trevor, who is a low-key Peter Venkman type stand-in. Again, he's supposed to be the sort of sarcastic kid with the quick quips, and he's the one who's going to try to sort of call it as he sees it.
Hey, remember that one summer we died under a table?
He's completely underused. I think he has maybe 2 sarcastic lines in the beginning of the movie, and then for the majority of it, he's just completely wasted. He ends up getting a summer job at a burger place, and he only does so because he's interested in the girl who works there. His character never really has an arc because they never progress the romantic storyline far enough for it to matter within the film. There's a moment where he opens up a garage and he sees the original Ecto-1. Apropos of nothing, he decides, I'm going to fix this. Now, it would have made sense if there was a scene where he thought, hey, if I had a car, I could impress this girl. We don't even understand why he's not questioning the fact that the original Ecto-1 is in a garage. And this brings up a really big sticking point that makes the movie very difficult to follow or understand. We never understand why the Ghostbusters aren't nationally known or revered for anything. The only person in the entire town who seems to know anything about them is Paul Rudd. And he does it, with YouTube videos. The idea that you would grow up in a world and not have any understanding, connection, history about the events in New York City in 84 and 89 is crazy.
None of this rings a bell?
It happened 20 years before we were born. I believe it.
When you have events like this that are so big, it would truly be the equivalent of having a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old not know anything about 9/11. This comes up later when Phoebe is in class and Paul Rudd is asking about the ghost trap. The ghost trap scene also doesn't make sense. And this is why this is... Okay, so Phoebe finds the ghost trap because Egon leads her to it. And then she brings it to Paul Rudd. Paul Rudd not only explains everything about the Ghostbusters, he then proceeds to open the trap. This is one of the biggest jumps in logic for the entirety of the movie, and it only gets worse. The problem with this is that, especially as a scientist, as the adult in the situation, at this point he's watching these kids, he's the only one who knows what a trap does. So the idea that he tried to open it goes to show just either how stupid he is or how stupid the writing is. Now, they try to sort of hand wave this away by him saying, like, oh, the point of science is to be reckless.
Are you sure this is safe?
Safe? No. Science is giving yourself the plague and gambling on the cure.
Science is reckless.
Totally! Yes! It's punk rock!
No, I'm sorry. It's counterintuitive to what anyone in that situation would do. Now, what would have been better is if Phoebe and Podcast, this is the worst name ever, are missing in class, okay? And Paul Rudd is like concerned because he's like, well, Phoebe's the only one who really should be here. Phoebe's actually intelligent. So he goes into the back of the school and he sees the two of them playing around with the trap. And so he's like concerned because he knows what a trap does. And he understands that these are kids and they don't know what they're doing. So as he runs over to them, he doesn't get there in time and the kids open the trap. Okay. Then you can have your expository dialogue explaining what it is, who the Ghostbusters are. But instead they do it in this opposite fashion, and it makes everyone in the movie look like a complete fucking idiot.
Yes!
Paul Rudd is then surprised when a ghost comes out and, travels back to Doom Mountain. Also, for whatever reason, the ghost takes the road. I mean, the ghost literally goes down the road back to the mountain. Wouldn't the ghost just go straight? I mean, it's like, I'm so elated that the ghosts from hundreds, thousands of years ago were following, traffic rules. Later, we get a scene where Phoebe and Podcast have decided to try to work on the proton pack. This is another issue with the movie because it doesn't suggest that anyone in this movie has any real intelligence. Phoebe is wearing the proton pack, which is also hard to believe because you have to imagine this thing weighs at least 50 or 60 pounds, and she's got to be 75 pounds soaking wet. So the fact that she could even possibly hold this thing on her is completely preposterous. She then somehow knows the correct order in which way to switch everything on. I'm sorry, I feel like there's no possible way that she would be able to get that. She knows on the wand which way to flip it on. There's about 2 or 3 buttons there. There's a button on the back. And a lot of this is, again, the sort of fan service that is being directly referenced to the first movie. The whole point of this scene is to remind you of things that you've already seen before.
It's just occurred to me we really haven't had a completely successful test of this equipment.
Oh, God, sit down. Oh, my God. All right.
I blame myself.
So do I.
Then, as soon as they discover how to use the proton pack, there is this, I think it's Cruncher or something. It's like a Slimer ripoff that happened just by complete happenstance. Happens to be in a warehouse right next to them. And they decide to go hunting for it. This could have made a little bit of sense if we knew in the beginning of the movie and throughout the film that there was possibly this Cruncher type creature that was sort of, urban legend or folklore within the town itself. Again, these are like little bits of just basic screenwriting. It's all about setup and payoff. The whole movie is expecting that it's only payoff. And it does so because it doesn't do setup within this movie. All of the setup is done in the first movie.
Song.
Movies as a whole, to some degree, even sequels, they need to exist within a vacuum. They need to make sense within the confines of the hour 30 or 2 hours that you're watching the movie. That would be like having a joke that a comedian told that was only funny if you listened to a set they did 5 years ago. Well, it doesn't work like that. You can't do a 2-hour HBO special and be like, well, it would have been funnier if you guys watched the one I did 10, 15 years ago, but you know what, here we are. If you're not laughing, then, the problem is you. So anyway, Phoebe and Podcast go into this warehouse where they're tracking down a ghost. The ghost can spit bullets or something, which again is like you're putting kids in ridiculous amounts of danger that do not come off as being realistic in any way. One of the biggest and best things, not so much in the second movie, but at least in the first Ghostbusters movie, is that it feels like a lived-in world. It feels like everything that's happening is actually happening. And I think that's why the movie works so well. I think that's why it resonates now, almost 40 years later, because the Ghostbusters in the movie are approaching every scenario, every situation like a normal person would.
We picked up this guy. Now we don't know what to do with him. Bellevue doesn't want him, and I'm afraid to put him in the lockup. And I know you guys are into this stuff, so I figured we'd check with you.
All right. You better bring him inside.
So at this point, and just because it has to happen in the script, because someone said on page 64, Finn needs to meet up with Phoebe and Podcast because they need to go chase this ghost. Finn fixes the car and pulls up to Phoebe and Podcast. They then get in the car and proceed to chase the Cruncher ghost. Now, this even could have worked, again, if they knew who the Cruncher ghost was. Phoebe could have said, we found the Cruncher ghost, and then because they understand about the urban legend, Finn says, wow, I know how dangerous that is. My girlfriend, or the girl that I'm interested in, has been talking about him. We need to catch him. And then it gives Finn agency, because now he's thinking, hey, if I can catch this ghost that everyone in the town knows about, that's going to earn me some cred, right? That's going to earn me some points with this girl. And so it gives him a reason to want to be there. That's the biggest problem with this movie. There's no reason for anyone to want to be there. It's just a lot of things that are happening. At some point in the movie, Podcast goes into the old house, and out of the thousands of books that are there, he literally just happens to pick up the book that talks about Gozer and the Sumerians and the terror dog, and he's flipping through the pages like, oh, I saw that, and I saw that, and that's what this is. Like, how on earth would he know that?
Isn't this what we saw there?
The Sumerians believed in a land of the dead. The gatekeeper and keymaster must assume the form of beasts.
Again, this is something that can be very easily fixed if this was a book that was prominently displayed with the page open because Egon was reading about it moments before he was, eaten or abducted by the terror dog in the beginning of the movie. Then it would say, okay, we've set this up for you earlier in the movie, and now the payoff is 30, 40, 50 minutes into the movie. But it does the thing where it's saying, well, the setup was actually 35 years ago in a movie that we're hoping you've seen before you've watched this movie.
I could look for the name Zool in the usual literature.
Spade's catalog.
Tobin's Spirit Guide.
Yeah. Song.
And this movie is completely replete with all of the memorabilia you would expect that are essentially just worthless throwaway sight gags. The Crunch Bar, the Twinkie in the glove box, the symmetrical book stacking, which also doesn't make sense. Why would you have symmetrical book stacking in a house where the librarian ghost wasn't there? At some point, there's a scene where Phoebe uses a fire pole to go down to a sort of underground lab. And this is where she finds her grandfather's, all of his experiments and such. Again, the idea that there's a fire pole doesn't make sense. This is the idea of trying to remind you of things that you've seen before because it's trying to induce a positive feeling while you're watching this. It's not reliant on its own new visuals or creativity to do that because there's no chance that it can do that because it's not written to do that.
All right, that's bad. Okay.
We then get to a point in the movie where the kids all end up in jail. This is another moment where they try to remind you of Ghostbusters 1 when they're all in jail. There's a lot of expository dialogue. We then find out that Finn's wannabe girlfriend's dad runs the jail. Things go from bad to worse when there's this escalation process where Phoebe's mom comes in and just starts yelling at them. The reason a scene like this doesn't even make sense is because, again, Bokeem doesn't even know who the Ghostbusters are.
But they are the first to destroy half of Main Street with whatever the hell that thing is.
Whoa! There's this whole subplot running through the movie that Phoebe's mother wants nothing to do with Egon.
Don't you think your father came out here for a reason?
I think he was a sad old man who turned his back on his family, his partners, and for what? For a stupid farm in a town nobody cares about.
And the problem with this is that we never get a backstory. We never know why this is. It would have at least added some depth or some lore if she explained, oh, when I was a very little girl, my dad left. And he left and he was a famous Ghostbuster. And he never wrote and he never did anything. And, I was left on the side. I didn't even know who he was. I didn't find out till I was in my teens, all right? Whatever the backstory is, it's drastically needed.
Yeah, great decision, Dad.
You know, I should have been your father. I mean, I could have been.
So apparently there's also this really weird true Hollywood love story that happened in the 1980s with Harold Ramis.
So, what, Bernier?
I'd like to run some gynecological tests on the mother.
Who wouldn't?
And this story wouldn't come out publicly. I think it was published in a book in 2018, 2019. And apparently he had a daughter with the director of Clueless. And the daughter's name was Molly Heckerling.
Oh, you. It's always the quiet ones. You hound.
What's interesting about this is that Molly wouldn't find out herself about any of this until she was about 15 years old.
I think we hit the honeypot.
You're not sleeping with it, are you, Ray?
Now, you would imagine within the scene of the other Nepo babies and such that, you know, Jason Reitman and everyone knew about this. But I can't imagine for the life of me, if they were actually going to go ahead with this movie and Harold Ramis was alive, that he would have written in a daughter that he had out of wedlock into a story like this. What's also bizarre is how similar Molly Heckerling looks to Carrie Coons, which to me suggests that this entire thing was a little too purposeful to be coincidence. And all of this would make low-key perfect sense as to why Carrie Coons' character is completely estranged from Egon. But it's bad writing, which means that it was, if this is the case and it's not just coincidence, then this was done purposefully. And I don't know why you would do something like that purposefully, unless either you had an axe to grind or you were low-key looking to tell the world what really happened.
Let's see what happens when we take away the puppy.
It's perplexing to me that any of this went through a basic approval process. When Paul Rudd is in the Walmart, for no reason, he starts seeing marshmallow men come out of the package. Now, this is done for laughs. It's fine. The problem is that there's no setup for it. It wasn't like, again, suddenly there were all of these incidents all over the small town that were supernatural that people were noticing and having to avoid. It's just talking marshmallow men, which also doesn't really make sense because after the events of Ghostbusters 1, you figure the Marshmallow Company would have had to completely rebrand. If there was a 50-foot marshmallow man that killed hundreds of people in Manhattan, pretty sure they're not going to be making Stay Puft Marshmallows anymore.
He conjured up a 100-foot marshmallow man, flew the top 3 floors off an uptown high-rise, ended up getting sued by every state, county, and city agency in New York.
Egon, I didn't imagine this.
Later, Phoebe calls a number that she saw on a YouTube clip that was on TV.
Don't we get a phone call?
Who you gonna call?
Song.
Now, she calls them, and Ray picks up the phone. Ray from Ray's Occult. We have one of the worst exposition dumps in film history.
Ray's Occult and we're closed.
Wait!
Ray, without knowing who he's even talking to, explains everything that went wrong with the Ghostbusters. Now, this almost could have worked if he knew who he was talking to earlier in the phone conversation, but he doesn't find that out until he's already told this random person everything that's already transpired in the last 25 years. He briefly makes mention to the fact that the Ghostbusters firehouse has turned into a Starbucks, although we find out at the end of the movie that that's not the case. And if you want to say like, oh, well, that was some improv line, then take it out. Edit it out.
Well, the trending tip of the day is the fact that you can order this Ghostbusters Secret Starbucks menu frappuccino. I love it because of what it looks like. Like, don't you just see the Ghostbusters car?
No!
Eventually, the kids make their way back to the sheriff's station because they need to reclaim all the gear because they got to go take on Gozer themselves. Now, you would expect that the daughter of Bokeem would have to convince him that, you know, shit was hitting the fan and point out the window and say, like, look at all the ghosts coming, just like in Ghostbusters 2.
Somebody get me the Ghostbusters.
And he would relent and say, okay, you know what, you guys are right. Let me help you, right? He would almost be like the mayor character in the first 2 movies. But no, that's not the case. There's no one in the sheriff's station. That's the problem. There's this bit where you expect that, like, the town is going to be overrun. there almost could have been a montage. You should have seen all of the police not knowing what to do, or like, police cars like in ditches or on fire, something, anything. Instead, we get two references, one to a cartoon and one to the taxi cab driver in the first movie, and that's it. And that's supposed to represent pandemonium. We then get to the scene where Carrie Coon makes it to the mountain, where she essentially decides that she's going to be Sigourney Weaver. She rips off her shirt, and she has a dress very similar to the one that Sigourney Weaver has in Ghostbusters. Again, why?
Are you the Keymaster?
Yes.
I don't know.
Come on. Dana. Can I talk to Dana? What a lovely singing voice you must have.
Why? Sigourney Weaver had that dress because it was in her closet and it was left over from the fucking 70s. That's why she had that dress. That was the joke. This is what she puts on when she wants to get it on. That's it. The idea that there would be a reference to something like that would be so specific, the only people who would know it would be the fans. And this is what I'm talking about when there's a severe lack of creativity. Nobody wanted to do anything new. That's the sad part. Nobody wanted to make anything. They wanted to remind you about what this movie was. But before Carrie Coon gets to the mountain, she jumps out the window and the kids follow her outside. And this is where Phoebe sees the word dirt on the side of the house. And she decides to start digging through the dirt. Now, the problem with this is that the dirt sign has been there the entire time that Phoebe's been staying at the house, and she never thought to look in the dirt before. Why she'd think now doesn't make any sense. What would have been smarter, what could have been better, what would have had some semblance of a script would have been if there was maybe part of the sign that was covered. Maybe there was a palette there and it covered the D or something, right? So it said IRT. And as soon as they get to the house initially in the beginning of the movie, they could have been like, well, what does IRT mean? Right? They start coming up with, whatever they think the initials stand for, and they kind of come up with nothing, whatever. Maybe when Phoebe's mother jumps out the window, she knocks the pallet over and it reveals the D. And now it says dirt. And now there's a reason for them to look in the dirt that they didn't have before.
This isn't a farm. It's a trap.
You see, this is what basic setup is. This is what basic payoff is. And there's nothing like that in the movie. It also gives a reason for Phoebe's mother to jump out the window and not the front of the house earlier in the movie. You see, these are the elements that come together when you have a competent writing staff, when you have a competent director. Eventually, the original Ghostbusters show up. They have their gear, they have their flight suits on. We don't know how they get there. We didn't hear a car show up. What would have made sense is if, Ray still had the car from the second movie and the three of them showed up in that, right? It would have been like, oh, okay, well, that's where the other car has been. And so they show up and they do a cross the streams thing that doesn't work. Doesn't make sense why it doesn't work, because it worked in the first movie. So you have these little bits of writing that contradict the original story, that only make a difference if you've seen the original story.
Not necessarily. There's definitely a very slim chance we'll survive.
For no reason whatsoever, there's a bunch of marshmallow babies in the back of the car that start attacking Podcast. All you needed was one scene of someone buying a bag of marshmallows and having it in the car. Maybe Finn bought them because what's-her-face says that she wants to make s'mores at a campfire. Anything. There's no setup at all. And it's really just so that they could have Podcast walk out of the car at the end of the movie looking like Ray with all the marshmallow on him. It seems to me that the current state of the film industry has no interest in following its own rules of continuity. They have completely gotten rid of all script supervisors. There's not one person saying, well, this line on page 105 contradicts this line on page 210. There's nothing like that. There's no one to look at a scene and say, what's the motivation here? This is crucial for film. This is crucial for storytelling. This is the problem with Nepo babies. This is the problem with Jason Reitman.
Well, you know, I am the son of a Ghostbuster, so I guess it's no surprise that this is a movie about the daughter and grandchildren of a Ghostbuster.
You know what this means, right? Your grandfather was a Ghostbuster. Yes, I'm aware.
Jason Reitman, I'm convinced, only made this movie because he didn't want Max Landis to make it or something. Another fellow Nepo baby.
So I started to think about, like, what would my Ghostbusters 3 actually be? I got really excited. I wrote up this long document and I pitched it. And they're like, we're gonna make another Ghostbusters movie. Jason Reitman, the son of the original director, Ivan Reitman, he got the job. And when the movie finally came out, a bunch of people hit me up to be like, hey, there's parts of your Ghostbusters pitch in Afterlife.
He, for whatever reason, felt he was going to take it upon himself to make this thing and didn't really care or wasn't good at actually writing a script.
This is a movie that was made by people who love Ghostbusters. I'm talking about the cast, the crew, the visual effects artists, the prop people, the set deck.
This is the embodiment of Notice Me Senpai. You know, of daddy, you know, look at me.
You know, Ghostbusters Afterlife is an extraordinarily personal film for me because my father, Ivan Reitman, back in 1984, directed the original Ghostbusters. I was 6 years old on the set of that film, and never in my mind did I ever imagine directing this film.
Look, I'm tired of taking abuse from overprivileged 9-year-olds.
There's this idea that after The Force Awakens, and I actually think it started earlier than that, I think it was probably closer to, you know, Jurassic World, where all we're going to do is just cram as much stuff into a movie, make it move fast, and have it pay reference to the things that you think are this franchise that are not the characters. It's the gear, it's the music, it's the aesthetic in some way, right? It's the corporate branding that makes the movie. The industry thinks Ghostbusters is guys with proton packs who fight ghosts and they drive a loud car, and that's what they think it is.
And simultaneously make a movie that handed the proton pack back to audiences, the ghost trap, the PKE meter, the, you know, Ecto-1, and then finally the original guys.
Ghostbusters is not that. That's the window dressing. That's the stuff that makes it fun. But what works is the 3-4 schlubby assholes who are trying to work the system in a you know, Reagan-based 80s economy. That's the movie. That's what the movie's about.
Oh, well, look, when we started, busting ghosts was a gas. I mean, the economy was good, Reagan years.
Also, and why it works so well, is because New York City is a character in the film.
You know, I wanted to, you know, start fresh, you know, in a new location. This is a movie that doesn't take place in New York City. It takes place in the American West. And I wanted to make a family story.
The sarcastic, nihilistic cynicism of the entire scenario is what makes the movie work.
You know how much negative energy it must have taken to generate a flow this size?
Hey, New York, what a town.
There's none of that in this. This movie doesn't have any character. This movie tries to have heart, but again, the heart is only there if you are completely aware of something else that happened 40 years ago. The problem with being self-referential in movies is because it would be the equivalent of having sex with someone And then when you're in the middle of it, you whisper in someone's ear and remind them of all of the other better times that you've had sex together. That nobody would do that, right? The whole point of at least trying to make a movie is to, if not at least be as good, to outdo what was done before. Or, in a traditional sense, expand with, on the story. There's nothing here that expands on the story. It just, runs on vapor.
Why am I drippings with goo?
Now, I want to talk about Man-Children. I want to talk about why this movie did as well as it did. And I want to talk about the state of the audience in accepting something like this. I don't want to be the guy to say, you're an idiot if you liked this movie. This movie is for easy thinkers who genuinely don't want anything more than memberberry stew. And it's because they're too fucking stupid to realize that they are the reason that this industry is collapsing. They don't want to think for themselves. This is an entire generation that has been allowed to coast on easy thinking. There's no challenge anymore. What was great about film, especially in the 70s, and then it bled into the decades after, was that film used to challenge people. And stories. That's why we listen to stories, because we're able to live vicariously and put ourselves in situations that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. This is why zombie movies were so big. This is why most genre flicks do so well, Western and sci-fis, whatever it is. You want to be able to imagine I'm that person. But this is not an imagining of that. This is a remembrance of when you were a kid and life was easy. This movie is for man babies. This is for guys who genuinely have had very little strife in their life. And it's made by those people as well.
Oh, it has a gunner seat?
If you see anything unusual, you know who to call. Ghostbusters!
The point of art is to push the envelope. Every time. As soon as you start relying on the tried and true again and again and again, this is not art. This is panderous. This is a crayon drawing. The only reason that movies like this come out is because the studios are convinced that there's a large enough audience that refuses to think for itself. And you could make an argument of, oh, well, this movie is for 13-year-olds. The only problem is this movie isn't. This movie is made for 40-year-olds. This movie is made for 45-year-olds. This movie wants to be for kids, but it wants to be for adults, and then it sort of ends up in this sort of weird middle ground territory and just completely falls apart as a result. The newer Ghostbuster movie, the Frozen Empire movie, is not directed by Jason Reitman. I would not be surprised in the slightest to find out that Sony didn't want him to do it. They said, let's bring in someone new, because they heard all of the criticism, whether it was Red Letter Media or anyone else who's worth anything in the critic circuit. And they listened and said, you know what? We don't want to admit it, but this is not cinema. This is like the argument that Martin Scorsese had. These movies have turned into rides. And Ghostbusters Afterlife does a really decent job at pretending it's a film. It's a competently made disaster. It has establishing shots and cutaways and you know, there's a cinematography to it. But at the same time, there isn't one piece of music in here that wasn't lifted from the first movie. There are multiple lines, scenes, shots that are directly pulled from the first movie.
There are sound effects that were literally pulled from the sound files of the 1984 film. There are pieces of music that were pulled from the original score.
Song.
Then you're going to start noticing props, details in the background, little things in the visual effects.
And because of that, Ghostbusters Afterlife is not a movie. This is a eulogy. This is a remember when. Remember when things were great. Remember when Ghostbusters were cool. Ghostbusters Afterlife is essentially remember Ghostbusters 1, the movie. And I can just go watch the first movie. So fuck this shit.